Today, how to turn a setback into a comeback. I suspect that if we were to poll this congregation, it would be about a 100% chance that every one of us has had some form of a setback at some point or other. Maybe it's bills, and you see them piling up, and you finally start to unbury just a little bit, and you see light at the end of the tunnel, and then something major breaks. You need a new roof on the house, or maybe some big engine thing goes clunk in your car. Something happens, and you think, well, here we go again. Get the shovel out, let's keep digging. Or maybe you've been in school. This happened to our oldest daughter in college, and she got into school, and just about right after she got going into a semester, she got mononucleosis. Knocked her right out of a couple of good weeks. But my daughter had to do a lot of catch up in college. Some of you have experienced some physical or health setbacks, and they can be massive sometimes. I'm always so grateful to see, and it's such an encouragement to see people back when they've had health setbacks, because you're an example to us of people who are persevering and persisting. And I think, I'm so glad that we get to gather together and see each other that way, because you encourage each other. And then sometimes you're starting to get good feedback at work, and you think, I think I may be up for a promotion, maybe even a raise. And then 2 days later, you get the pink slip. That's happened to folks, and it hurts. And it's a big setback, and it's one that you can't help but take personally, because you thought, did I just misread what was going on? What is going on here? We knew a young man, our family, who lost a job just a few weeks ago, and it kind of looks like maybe the people who had the authority to hire and fire were trying to get some of their friends in. And so even though they'd been telling him he was doing a great job, he was out the door. That hurts, but that's a setback. Sometimes you can go along for a long time, and there are no arguments in the family. Everything seems fairly copacetic. And then that one relative shows up for Thanksgiving dinner, and they start talking politics. And oh boy, things start just unraveling again, and you think, well, there goes the 127 days since our last argument. Sometimes that relational conflict can blow up again, and you think it's fine, and when it does blow up, it comes in even hotter than it was before, and it just kind of whips everybody into a frenzy, and it's an anxiety-producing kind of thing. Let me give you a background to the guy we're going to talk about, our Bible hero today. There was a guy named Abraham. We've talked about him in that Matthew series from 3 years ago. We talked about Abram. He was called out of the Ur of Chaldees. His name was changed from Abram to Abraham, which means father of many nations. God gave him that huge promise. He said, I'm going to bless the whole world through your descendants. Abraham had a son of promise, whose name was Isaac. And then Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob's name was then later changed to Israel. That's where we get Israel from. And it was through the nation of Israel that God had this plan to bless all the nations of the world through the Messiah that would come through that line. So that's the background for this guy. And Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph was number 11. That's exactly my place in the trombone section at Northern Arizona University, Flagstaff, Arizona, when I was a freshman in college. I had been sort of the top dog in the trombone section in high school because I'd worked my way up to first chair. Thank you very much. And then I auditioned, and I got a scholarship to actually be paid to go play trombone in the marching band for the Fumblecjacks, or the Lumberjokes, or the Lumberjacks. We didn't have a very good football team, but we had a really good marching band. But I found out, even after I thought I'd nailed my audition, that I was number 11 out of 12 trombones. Wow, that'll kick you down a notch. So I had my work cut out for me. But that was Joseph. He was number 11 out of 12 sons. These were 10 half-brothers, one full brother. There's probably also at least one half-sister. There may have been others that weren't named, but that was a large family, and they were from 4 different wives. Now, if you talk about a difficult Thanksgiving dinner, there were some issues that could have made it very difficult and rather trying in a very blended family like that. Setback number 1 for Joseph. We're going to zip through a bunch of them. Joseph was mistreated by his siblings. Now, I know that my sister mistreated me terribly when I was a kid, or at least so I said. I kept saying, you always loved her more than you loved me. No pointing, please. However, in my case, we joke about it, but we get along really well. In Joseph's case, he really was mistreated. And it was because his father really was he chose a favorite. He clearly chose a favorite. Look at Genesis 37. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. And it was from the wife that he'd worked so hard to try to get. The first one he didn't get, and then that was Leah, I think, and then Rachel. Am I getting those two names right? And then Rachel, he'd worked another 7 years in this indentured servitude kind of arrangement before he could actually get the correct bride. And so he really loved this kid, Joseph. One day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful, colorful robe. And of course, you know that probably went over really big with his brothers. They're thinking, okay, Dad hasn't given us a nice, long, colorful robe like that. This would be a really expensive garment back then. And he was clearly showing blatant favoritism in front of all the other family members. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word about him. Not even one. And it was not Joseph's fault. Now, there was something that he did that was probably just out of youthful exuberance, that he probably didn't help his case any because he shared a dream. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But he couldn't help the fact that his father chose to make him a favorite. That was not his fault. What I'm going to really talk about today has to do with these setbacks that are not necessarily caused because of our own bad choices. There have been some other messages that we've had where we talked about that. Yes, we can cause our own situations. And if we're not wise, if we don't follow God's leadership, we can make some pretty dumb choices and we can cause problems for ourselves. But today we're really focusing on this guy because most of what happened to Joseph happened to him from external sources. It wasn't his own doing. Setback number 2. Joseph was rejected, not just talked about badly or mistreated by his siblings, but rejected by his siblings. Rejection's tough, isn't it? I mean, rejection is hard. It's hard for all of us. Sometimes people get rejected for whatever reasons, and they don't know how to process that grief. Unfortunately, I read an article last week about suicide rates going up, and so many of them are connected to rejections individually, because if there's a breakup in a relationship, people don't know what to do about that. They're saying they have these clingy relationships where one of the one who's rejected keeps Facebook stalking the other person, or they keep trying to text them, they keep trying to weasel their way back into that relationship, and just saying, instead of saying, hey, we're done, I'm walking away, they just can't let it go because they've wrapped up so much of their identity in that relationship that they don't know what to do about it. Rejection's tough, and Joseph experienced a lot of rejection. In fact, this is that dream I was talking about. One night, Joseph had this dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. Just when we thought they couldn't hate him anymore, they hated him more. What was the dream? The first, it was a two-parter. The first was about these sheaves or bundles of grain. And all these 11 bundles of grain in the dream bowed down to his bundle. And of course, he had to go and blab that to his brothers. He says, all of your bundles of grain were bowing down to my bundle of grain. I'm sure that really went over great. And then the second part of that dream was that the sun, moon, and 11 stars were all bowing down again to his star. Now that really probably didn't make him feel real good. But we do see in reading through that whole series of the last several chapters of the book of Genesis that this was a foreshadowing to some things that actually did take place. And then in 37, starting in verse 18, when Joseph's brothers saw him coming, this is when they were out at a distance, they'd been caring for some sheep, and they saw him coming, they recognized him at a distance, and as he approached, they said, you know, we need to make up with him, so let's go buy him a Dairy Queen and sit down and have a chat. No, that's the unparaphrased, unpublished version. What is actually published in the real Bible is that as he approached, they made plans to kill him. I mean, this thing's escalated. It's become murderous now, to the point of them literally, some of those brothers wanting to take Joseph's life. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. It's a big earthen hole in the ground where if they can collect water, they can use it for drinking purposes or feeding their cattle. We can tell our father, a wild animal has eaten him. And then we'll see, it's the first fake news, by the way, is all the way back here at Genesis. And then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. That's how angry they were. I mean, this has become homicidal. Rejection is difficult, and Joseph must have sensed that a long time coming, and he must have really sensed it when he actually started to get dealt with by his brothers. But when Reuben, the oldest kid, who probably was maybe even thinking of his own father and thinking, ooh, but what will Dad think about it if we were to follow through on that plan? He makes a little different suggestion. Now, to his credit, he makes a good suggestion that keeps Joseph alive, but not to his credit, he's trying to do it secretly. Reuben hears of their scheme. He comes to Joseph's rescue. He goes, let's not kill him, he says. He says, well, why should we shed any blood? In other words, we're going to have to try to cover this up, and then we'll all be indicted in that. And it's tough to have a good collusion and get away with it because it's, somebody's going to blab and we're going to rat out the other one. That's what would be going through my mind if I were the older brother. But it doesn't say that. That was my speculation. Let's just throw him in this empty cistern here in the wilderness, and then he'll just die without our laying a hand on him. We'll let the weather take care of it. Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. Okay, he's going to do it secretly. At least he's going to do it. I don't think it was the right way, but we have to give him some credit at least. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the source of their anxiety and anger. They got rid of that thing that they hated so badly, which was his coat, his beautiful robe. They ripped it off of him. Then they grabbed him and threw him into the cistern. And when the cistern, fortunately, was empty at this time, Joy and I saw in the desert out near Jerusalem some of these cisterns in the desert. And when they get filled with water, they really get filled up with water. Even on top of Masada, they had this several 1,000-gallon hole in the ground that would help supply water for 1,000 people to live up on top of that mountain. So they can be really huge, and they can be very, very deep. This one was empty. Fortunately, there was no water in it. It looked probably something kind of like that. So you can see why it would be difficult for somebody to get out unless you had somebody to throw you a rope or a ladder. Setback number 3. Joseph was sold out. And literally, in this case, sold out for money. That happens all the time. We see it in politics. We see it in business. A partner will sell somebody out. He'll say one thing and do something else behind somebody's back. It happens, and he was sold out for money. Judah, another one of the older brothers, said, what will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to these Ishmaelite traders that are coming along. He's thinking, hey, win-win. We get rid of the problem, and we get some money to boot. So they're thinking, all right, after all, he sounds so noble here. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. You should know that the going rate for a slave in that day was 30 pieces of silver. So what does that say about how much they valued their brother? Less than a slave. And the traders took him to Egypt. And that brings us again to another lesson we learned from Joseph, that a majority can be wrong. All you have to do is watch the news in this last couple of months and some of the laws that are being passed in various states and know that a majority can be very, very wrong. Even though you can get 11 brothers that would say, yeah, I think this is the right course of action, all 11 of those can be terribly wrong. Setback number 4. Joseph lost his identity, and I mean lost it completely, because when word got back to his father, they had sent his robe with blood from a young goat that they had killed, and they sent that beautiful robe to their father with this message. Look what we found. Doesn't this robe belong to your son? They didn't even say our brother. He said, your son? Jacob refused to be comforted. He was totally distraught. He said, yes, that's my son's robe. I gave it to him. I'll go to my grave mourning for my son, he would say, and then he would weep some more. So he was just inconsolable with grief, because to him and all the people back home, Joseph was gone. He was dead. He was no more. So he lost his identity. A lot of people lose their identity in different ways. Athletes can get an injury, and all of a sudden, all of their life's effort that's been put into being a strong athlete just goes out the window, and they don't know what to do with the rest of their life. Said, I didn't have a plan B. Who am I now if I can't succeed as an athlete? Moms do that if they poured themselves into raising their kids, and then all of a sudden their kids get up and they grow up and they get married and they move out of the house, and a mom's left going, I don't know what to do with myself. Who am I now? I have to reinvent myself, so to speak. It's easy for all of us to lose our identity. People can do that if they're putting too much of themselves into a relationship, like I mentioned before. And then if suddenly there's a breakup, they think, I am nobody without this other person. Well, you certainly are if you put your identity in with Jesus Christ. Know what God thinks about you. Setback number 5. Joseph was forced into a job he didn't want. It was not on his thing-to-do list. He didn't look at his iPhone and say, okay, what do I have next week? I'm going to go audition for a job with Potiphar in Egypt. That wasn't even on his radar. So he's forced to go with these Ishmaelite traders, and he's sold as a slave, and he gets put into Potiphar's household. Meanwhile, the Midianite traders arrive in Egypt, where they sold Joseph to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Potiphar was captain of the palace guard. So this is a high muckety-muck. And that's the guy that Joseph eventually winds up in the care of. Setback number 6. Joseph was punished for doing the right thing. No good deed goes unpunished, as they say. He was punished for doing the right thing. The Bible says about Joseph that he was good-looking, he was handsome, he was a rugged young man, and that he was kind, and all these qualities which Potiphar's wife noticed, unfortunately. Also, unfortunately, Potiphar's wife was not a very scrupulous woman, and so Potiphar, who was this very powerful man, was off at work a lot when Joseph was caring for the household, because Potiphar had put Joseph in charge of everything in Potiphar's household. And Potiphar's wife, is, in a sense, just tried to kind of put the moves on Joseph. And Joseph kept rebutting that and saying, no, that would be wrong. That would be a slap in my boss's face, and it would be a slap in God's face. I can't do that. I won't do that. And finally, one afternoon, she got so aggressive that she grabbed a hold of his tunic, and the only way that he could escape was literally to come out of the tunic, and ran away without his tunic. So she kept it, and then concocted a story and tried to frame him by saying, look what I found. He came in there and tried to do terrible things. Potiphar was furious when he heard this story, even though it was fake news, about how Joseph had treated her. And so he actually got thrown in prison. Setback number 7, Joseph was forgotten by those he had helped. God gave Joseph a unique ability to be able to interpret dreams. And the first time we see that was 2 guys that he was in prison with, a couple of his prison mates. One was a baker, the other was a candlestick maker. No, that was the other story. One was a baker, the other was the guy who would hand the guy his wine. He was the steward to Pharaoh. And so these 2 guys were in there, and they both had dreams, and they both meant different things. And they both asked Joseph, can you interpret the dreams? Joseph was honest in saying, I don't have that ability, but God can. So I'm going to ask God. And God gave him the ability to interpret these dreams. The one guy, the baker, didn't turn out so well. He did get released from prison, but he was killed later. It was awful. The other guy, though, the guy who was the steward, the cupbearer, says, you're going to be freed in 3 days. That's what your dream means. And when you're out, when you go out to see Pharaoh, don't forget me, because I'm here unjustly. I was sold into slavery by my brothers, and I was sent here. And so say a good word for me, would you? Did he do that? No. It says, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. And we can read ahead and see that it was 2 years before anything came up again about that. 2 years. How's it like to be rejected by your whole family, your brothers, to lose your identity, get thrown in prison unjustly for doing the right thing, and then have the one guy who might be able to put in a good word for you completely ignore you for 2 solid years? Wow. Talk about setbacks. But here's the thing. God knows our future just as he knew Joseph's. He works his plan even though it feels sometimes like that plan is taking forever. And God can turn these setbacks into stepping stones to get us where he wants us. Look at what Joseph did and what we can do in our setbacks. He depended on God's presence in all situations. If you look at the thread that's all through these 13 chapters that shows up in the story, we see this phrase, and God was with Joseph. He was with Joseph in the cistern. He was with Joseph in prison. He was with Joseph in Potiphar's house. He was with Joseph every step of the way until finally God exalted him, put him in charge second only unto Pharaoh himself. He patiently depended on God's plan. This was the plan. Pharaoh recognized what a good guy Joseph was because he was continuing to do the best he could with what he had to offer. And then he has a dream, and he's saying, I need somebody to interpret this dream for me. He puts out the word to all of his magicians and the soothsayers and the people that might be able to do some stuff. None of them can interpret the dream. Somebody else says, oh yeah, by the way, it was probably that cupbearer. Now I remember, 2 years later, there's this guy that interpreted dreams for us when we were in prison. You should get him. Joseph says, I can't do it. God can. God gives him the interpretation. There were these 7 lean cows, real skinny cows, and then the 7 fat cows, but the 7 skinny cows actually ate up the fat cows. And then there were also another of 7 big fat heads of grain, and there were 7 scrawny, pitiful-looking heads of grain. and the same thing happened with the grain. He says, here's what it is. Both, it's a two-parter again. It's a two-part dream, but both mean the same thing. We're going to have 7 years of plenty. That's the fat cows and the fat heads of grain. And then we're going to have 7 years of famine. And we better prepare now. You need somebody in charge of putting lots of food aside, because if we do it right, we won't starve, and everybody's going to have to come to us, and you're going to have the corner on the market on wheat and grain, and we will survive everything. So Pharaoh says, well, because you're so smart, and you're the only one who can interpret these dreams, you're wiser than any of my other guys, I'm putting you in charge. And so God uses that not only to save Egypt, but he saves another country. He saves Israel, because Israel is able to come over and get food, and Pharaoh allows him to move his family to be closer with him, and there's this reconciliation. So he patiently depended on God's plan. He was 17 years old when he started down this path. And it took years to get to this place where finally God was using him to be in charge of saving the entire nation of Israel, so that God could fulfill that original plan through Abraham, that he was going to make them a great nation so that the Messiah could come along. Big, overarching plan. Can you imagine 3, 4, 5 years into this thing, what Joseph might have been thinking? Yeah, this is some plan, God. And yet God fulfilled that. You intended to harm me, he says to his brothers once his father finally died, and the brothers come and kind of beg him, please don't hurt us. Now that Dad's gone and he can't chastise us, we're really afraid you're going to really harm us, because you're so powerful. You're the most powerful guy in this land next to Pharaoh. He says, no, don't worry about it. I'm not going to hurt you. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. You hear the forgiveness that's happening here? He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. That's another thing that we see. He depended on God's help in each challenge, including helping him learn how to forgive his own brothers. That takes a lot. It's beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. That was a part of the help he received. When he knew he didn't have it, even within himself, to interpret dreams, he asked God for God's help, and God gave it to him. Here's what we can learn from Joseph's huge, difficult series of setbacks. Trust in God, his presence, his plan, his help, and most of all, learn to forgive those who have given us those setbacks. Joy and I had the privilege of housing one of the young men that God's put in our life. He's given us over the years several guys that for some reason have just become sort of spiritual sons. And we had this last Friday night and Saturday morning to be able to catch up with this guy. He had a difficult situation because his mom passed away not too long ago. He's got 2 sisters who still live in Michigan. He lives out of state. He couldn't make it back quickly to help his sisters because they were in Florida at the time. He had his whole family to take care of there. It took him a while to get there. So there was this big misunderstanding. One of his sisters was upset and says, well, you weren't here for us. And it could have been really contentious. So he was talking with us about that and praying it through. And he said, I had to remember some of the Bible scriptures that I'd been reading and saying, I've got to forgive the harsh words that she gave to me. And I don't want to return that in kind. So I'm praying for God to give me the wisdom to know how I can tackle the situation. Because I got to go up there and we have to sort through Mom's stuff. And I want to make sure that I'm trying to build a bridge and to make sure that we've got a strong family unit, because we're all we got left now. Dad passed away several years ago. Now Mom's gone. It's just me and my 2 sisters, and I don't want this to blow up. So we had prayer with him before he went up, and then he called us last evening and he said, well, it went really, really well. He said, fortunately, God was with me. I felt his presence. He gave us a plan. We worked the plan. His help was among us. And I said, it's just exactly what we've been talking about in Joseph's situation. Folks, this is not some fable or story that we share because it's a myth. This really happened to a real guy, and it still really happens with real people today, just like it happened to our good friend yesterday. And if we will do this and put our faith in God and trust him to help us through these difficult setbacks, he can turn those setbacks into stepping stones to get us exactly where he needs us so that his plan can be accomplished. Let's pray together. Father, it's tough when we're in the middle of a setback, because sometimes all we can see is our circumstance. I'm praying, thanks to Joseph's story, his real life situation, that you've given us a great example of what we can do, even if it seems to be taking a long time, longer than we would like. And I pray that if there's anybody right now who's experiencing a setback, that you'll just encourage them like crazy through your Holy Spirit, that they'll be able to trust you fully in what's going to be happening next, knowing that your help is available, your plan is being accomplished, and that you will be glorified in their lives if they'll put their trust completely in you. And I pray that you'll do that for all of us as we continue to step forward, looking for stepping stones, turning those setbacks into comebacks. And I pray in Jesus' name.